Uh, Thank you for joining us on today's webinar on how to move your programs virtually. So my name is Jennifer Fawcett. I work in Extension Forestry at NC State University. We are so happy to have you all with us here today. This webinar is targeted for natural resource professionals who are considering organizing virtual events in the future. As you know, there's been a lot of that lately with all of the events happening in the world. So all of our panelists today are also natural resource professionals who have some sort of experience in moving their programs to virtual platforms. We already have over 200 people, it looks like, with us today. From all over the world, so there seems to be a lot of interest in this area. We hope that you get a lot out of it. Feel free to ask lots of questions. Our goal is for it to feel very discussion based, and we're going to leave at least half an hour at the end. We'll try to get to all of your questions throughout. So I'd like to introduce today's presenters for our webinar. Okay, first we are going to have Andrea Lorick-Strauss out of University of Minnesota Extension talk about live events on social media. Bob Barden of NC State Extension will talk about webinars. Shan Kamek with the Georgia Department of Natural Resources will talk about the Georgia Prescribed Fire Council annual meetings and annual meetings in general. Laurel Kays from NC State Extension will talk about workshops and field days. And finally, Michael Robinson of the International Association of Wildland Fire will talk about conferences. So we'll hear from them. They're going to share their personal experiences and some of the lessons that they've learned in moving their programs to a virtual platform. They're going to cover all of the topics that you see here, anything from things you can do in your own backyard to kind of this more larger scale conference with hundreds or even thousands of people. So depending on what you're looking for, hopefully we'll find something for everybody here. So I do have just a few housekeeping tips that I'd like to cover before we start. So first, if you're having trouble hearing the webinar, just try adjusting your sound in the audio settings. This should be at the bottom of your screen. You can also join via telephone while remaining on the video conference by dialing in the number provided in your registration and then just enter the meeting ID number. Next, the chat feature allows you to message either the co-hosts, the panelists, or all the panelists and attendees. So it should look something like that. What I would suggest is that if you have a question that's a little bit more technical in nature, or if you just want to share something with just the panelists, to click that feature. But if you want to have a conversation with everybody or type something into the chat box that you want everybody to see, just make sure that you choose all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see it there. Okay, and then the Q&A feature is going to allow you to ask questions, and you're going to be able to do this throughout the webinar. So all of the panelists, we're going to be holding your questions until the very end of the webinar. So as we go along, they'll just be collecting there. If you have a specific question for a specific panelist, please include that in your note. If it's to somebody specifically, that will help me at the end to kind of help steer some of the conversations. You can also answer each other's questions. So this is kind of a cool feature. So you're going to be able to, there should be a comment button in there as people ask questions. I know a lot of you listening in today also have experiences with some of these things. So feel free to enter your own experiences or your own comments into that Q&A feature. If somebody else asks a question that you have an answer for, go ahead and add that into the comment box. We also have a feature enabled called the upvote. So it looks like a little thumbs up, and if you see a question that you think that you have that same type of question, or it's similar, or you think there's a really great question, go ahead and click the little thumbs up, and that will move the question to the top. So the questions that have the most number of thumbs up are the questions that we'll answer first at the end. So the more thumbs up, I'll get to those first. Hopefully we'll have time for all of them, but if not, we'll at least attempt to get to the ones that have the most number of thumbs up. Okay, so finally, I just want to mention that this webinar will be recorded and available on demand on the Forestry webinar portal, hopefully early next week. So I actually put a link into the chat box where you can find the webinar. Like I said, it won't be available until next week, but it will be recorded if anybody has to leave early. So let's go ahead and get into the presentations. So first, we will hear from Andrea Lorick-Strauss, who is an extension educator and extension professor at the University of Minnesota Extension. Andrea experimented with Facebook Live for extension programming this spring, and she's now going to share her experiences and lessons learned with us. So thank you, Andrea.
Sure, thanks, Jennifer, and thanks for the invitation to be here. And like Jennifer said, we just tried some things out this year here in Minnesota, and if some of you in the audience have additional experience, we'd certainly be interested to hear about it. We tried some things out, and we just want to share what we learned. So in Minnesota, our natural resource program teams include a couple of sub-teams: our forestry team, our aquatic invasive species team, and our team we call Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Education. And that team runs our citizen science programming and our master naturalist programming. And so across these programs, a couple of us tried Facebook Live this spring. And I put links here, right here in the slide, the Google slide, because I hoped that these would be shared so that you could go and not have to search our Facebook pages to find them. You could just click on them and watch. But I also included some data here when they were offered. We started at the end of March and did a number of them in April and May. And usually they were about a half an hour long, sometimes shorter, sometimes very short. And we had probably at any given time 15 or 20 people actually watching the live event. But as you can see on the data on this slide, over time, since the initial broadcast of these events, we've had several hundred people view the recording of these live events. And so that's one of the benefits we'll talk about, is that even if there aren't a lot of people there watching you real time, a lot of people have access to the video later. And so that's especially valuable. I want to say that all of these three programs that I talked about, are forestry, aquatic invasive species, and our master naturalist and citizen science group is kind of one group, had a pre-existing Facebook audience, an audience that follows us on Facebook. Some of the audience includes people who have been to our workshops and some not. And so we already have an active Facebook presence. And so again, 5 different episodes here where we just tried things out. We just, let's go live and see what happens. And the first one was just let's do some winter tree identification. And the next one was around, the next 3 of them were around our City Nature Challenge participation. That's that international event where we try to document urban biodiversity, comparing ourselves to other places around the world. And then there was a session on aquatic plant monitoring in May. So we tried it out, we had some audience, and we learned some of the buttons to push and tricks to use. Another thing, though, that we did, those were more educational sessions, presentations, that sort of thing. We also have an event we call Trail Tuesday. Every Tuesday, our team members just go out and walk a trail for a minute or sometimes more, and share that on our Facebook groups. Sometimes that's using Facebook Live, sometimes it's pre-recorded and then uploaded. But that's another thing we use to track the evolution of the season of spring in Minnesota, which was pretty fun to see. So that was another thing we did. But here's what we learned. It all comes down to this. This is what we really want to know. We wrote up these learnings in a little white paper that I have shared with Jennifer, who can share with the group just what we did and what we learned about it. And the most important thing we learned is you got to practice. Just like any educational outreach, you kind of have to practice on your own Facebook page if you have one. You can set it so that it's viewed by only me, which means yourself, and then you can just see what you look like. You can practice a location. You can see, are you getting decent Wi-Fi? You can kind of figure out what you want to talk about. And so certainly, like with any educational session, do practice. We also found that using helpers really matters. You can use, say, a smartphone or a tablet on a selfie stick if you like, but all of us who did it here, we had a helper. I used my teenager, she's in my quarantine germ group, and so she held my iPad and broadcast for me. Our other colleagues who did this had their kid or their mom or whatever hold the hold the device. And that person then holds the camera. They can relay questions that are coming in real time, that kind of thing. And they can relay comments that are coming in to the speaker, so the speaker can just focus on what they're saying. Makes it a little bit more organized and formal. We also had a helper, though, who was just online, some other place, watching the live event and adding comments in the chat stream. They could copy and paste URL links so that other viewers could then have access to other resources, that kind of thing. So having a couple of people on tap to help make the broadcast be a little smoother, a little more professional looking, we found was really valuable. You'll also want to manage the light, which really means manage the darkness, the shadows. Keep an eye on like backlighting, avoiding shadows, trying it out. This is part of why you would practice, you know, the day before, so you can see, oh, the sun's from there, but I want to show this, so I should angle my body like this so people can see, that kind of thing. And just keeping aware of what kind of noise you'll experience. Sometimes there's a lot of ambient noise. In my neighborhood, when I was broadcasting from my front yard, I had dog walkers going by. Of course, it was garbage day, so the garbage truck came by. It's kind of anticipating some of those things. A big issue with a portable device is going to be wind that makes a lot of rattling noise in your microphone. And we experimented with putting a small sock, or you could put a piece of fabric, like fleece, over the microphone of your phone or tablet, and that would help muffle some of the wind noise as well. And keeping an eye on the autofocus feature. If you're going to be trying to demonstrate some specimens, a tree branch, or that kind of thing, you are going to need a backdrop so that the autofocus of your phone can zoom in on the correct thing. Otherwise, your device may have trouble focusing on the thing you want it to focus on. If you've had trouble taking pictures of specimens, you know how this happens. So I just put my hand behind, whatever it was, a flower, so I could show it. My colleague used a pillowcase so she could hold it behind the thing, and then the camera could focus on the tree branching pattern, that sort of thing. But anticipate what your camera may have difficulty focusing on. Another issue is lag time. Keep in mind that you're broadcasting in real time, and the people who are watching are going to have a minute or 3 before they actually see what you and hear what you're saying and can type in a comment or a question, and then it takes a little time for that to come back to you. And so if you ask a question, this is real time, you might expect an immediate response as you would were you to be in person, but you're not in person. You got to account for that delay that's going to happen. And so you might pose a question and then chat about something similar and wait for comments to roll in for your helper to relay back to you. Another thing to keep in mind is that once you start, hi everybody, we're having a Facebook Live event, it's gonna take a good 10 minutes sometimes for anybody to start watching you. Because even if people know they wanna watch it, they have to remember, they have to log in and all of that. So allow a good 10 minutes in the beginning to let people log in and find you and then start watching and that kind of thing. But expect that and just have some filler comments. Maybe you wanna show some resources, or introduce yourself, explain where you are, and kind of fill that time gracefully while you're waiting for people to arrive. I will say that initial 30 seconds is the most awkward thing ever, because you just push the button and you're like, am I live? I guess I'm live. Okay, I guess I should start talking. Are there people in the device? Okay, I guess I'll start saying something. And it's kind of weird, but I promise you it works out. And the other thing we learned is that to really build up interest, if you just magically start going live, if somebody happens to be on Facebook, they'll get a notification that you're live. But if they're not on Facebook, they didn't know to come and watch you, and there won't necessarily be anyone watching. So if you announce it ahead of time, we're going to have a Facebook Live event tomorrow. We're be sure to tune in for this guest expert who's going to be coming to our Facebook Live event. Kind of build up that awareness and that interest ahead of time. You can make it into a Facebook event on your Facebook page, and then people will receive notifications about it. You may want to get on and be live 10 minutes before the appointed start time too, just so you can get there and people can receive notifications and all of that. You could tell viewers to look at their screen and find the invite others button, and that will send a notification out to their audiences to remind those folks too that they may want to tune in to watch as well. So even if invitees don't immediately join, they'll still get the notification that it happened, and they can go back and watch the recording as well. There's a lot more tips on how to actually you know, push the correct buttons to be going live and all of that in that little article that the graphic shows. And again, that link is available. I just want to happen to say that Facebook Live is different from regular extension education. You don't know if anyone's watching. There's no immediate feedback. Do they like it? Are they sleeping? Who knows? The nice thing, though, is that you're reaching people where they're at. They didn't have to already know they're interested in order to tune in the same way they would in a workshop. I will say, though, that Facebook Live is the same as any good extension education. You still need to know your target audience. There might be others who show up, but who are you trying to reach? And be clear about that in your advance promotion. And be clear about your intended goals. What are you trying to accomplish in terms of your outcomes, your content that you're going to present, and in general, just apply what you know about adult learners. That same concept really is important in preparing this kind of, if you mean to be educational, same educational principles apply. I will say that YouTube has a live feature as well. So if you have a YouTube channel, you can go live there as well. And another feature that we've seen used well is Zoom being broadcast to Facebook Live or to YouTube Live. And so that has to do with the settings that you check when you set up the Zoom call that enables that possibility. But then all your presenters can be in a Zoom room and presenting and recording, but also then broadcasting to one of those social media, and that works great as well. As with any good extension education, evaluation matters. Facebook does provide some automated metrics. The people reached figure suggests who just kind of scrolled past it, who saw that it existed, but it's the engagements that really are more useful, I think, for us in extension. Who took some action at all related to the event that you posted? Were there likes, were there comments, were there shares? And that shows people put a little more effort into it. I will say, though, that in extension, we like to see, did people have behavior change? Do they have actual learning? And the Facebook metrics can't possibly provide that. So if you're looking for those kind of impacts, you're going to want to measure that in a separate way. So again, I'm happy to talk about Facebook Live with anybody in our experiments, and I hope that you can use those links to take a look at these, again, experiments. We are not polished performers. It's just us in front of our audience. And so, but have a look and see what we tried, and we'll get better as we go. All right, and I'm going to turn it over. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much, Andrea. That was fantastic. And I did put both of your links to both the virtual conference and what you learned from your Facebook Live into the chat box. So if anybody wants to see those, go ahead and check those out after today's webinar. So next, we have Dr. Robert Barden, the Associate Dean of Extension for the College of Natural Resources and NC State Extension. Bob has over 10 years of experience in producing and moderating more than 200 webinars on the nationally recognized Forestry and Natural Resources webinar platform. So lots of experience. Thank you, Bob.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you, everybody. Glad you were able to join today's webinar and everything. As Andrea has expressed, a lot of this is from just getting out there and doing it. I can tell you my first experience was in deciding to go down the route of doing webinars. That very first time was probably one of the scariest times in my career with using technology. So, you know, as Jen indicated, over the last 10 years, I've had lots of experience in doing webinars and using different softwares to do it. First started out on a program called Blackboard Collaborate. Actually, it was Illuminate at the time, and the university has now moved on to Zoom, which has actually worked easier and is more friendly, I find, when doing webinars. These are just some tips and tricks and best practices that I've learned over the years, and I've kind of put them into three categories. My first category here is how do I begin with doing a webinar. The first thing I often, when I first got started, was I developed a checklist. I early on discovered that establishing this to-do list allowed me to keep track of everything that I needed to do, all the tasks, so that I would complete items, ensure that I didn't miss a step or make a mistake in developing a webinar and getting ready for it to be delivered. The checklist also helped me to be efficient and helped to ensure that all the folks involved, participants, as well as the presenters, that they would have a good experience in doing a webinar. It's important to choose a topic that's relevant. I often find out the topic you choose will be the biggest factor in the number of people that participate in your webinar. It's my experience is most webinars are not driven by the need of somebody needing continuing education credits. They participate in the webinar because they're interested in the topic. And so choosing topics that are current or ones that address or solve a problem or ones that meet the audience's needs are the ones that are most likely to turn out your audience. Ways to determine topics for the webinars besides picking things that are current in the news cycles or current in within your profession is things that are new and current and being addressed is to look at surveying participants in current webinars or following up. Maybe you have an email list that you send out notices to that you could also poll that email list for topic ideas. Talking to your colleagues, look out what's out on social media related to your profession are all ways to get a topic for doing webinars. I would say preparation rules when it comes to doing webinars. A lot of presenters feel nervous, especially if it's their first time presenting a webinar. So taking time to work with the presenters on their presentation development and practicing with the technology that you're going to use. I often spend a lot of time emailing back and forth with my presenters since most of them are on a national platform and we're not in the same location. Sharing with them details, laying out the expectations, providing them some guidelines on putting their presentations together. And then we often schedule a practice session, usually about a week out from the live event so that they can become familiar with the webinar software if they haven't used it before. It also allows them to do things like test their audio and video as needed. It's important to invest in your equipment and technology. And really what I'm talking about here is a high quality mic. A good headset with a microphone that has noise cancellation works wonders. You don't have to spend a lot of money to get these features, but the audio is just that much better, higher quality. And if you're recording the webinars, it does a good job capturing that audio for viewing the webinar later on demand. You want to check your presentation quality. I often request that my presenters send me their PowerPoints a few days before the live event so that we can go over the quality of the presentation, making sure that the slides are readable, that there's no spelling mistakes, grammar's correct, images are of good quality so that they can be seen. It's important to realize that, you know, people are viewing, as you guys are today, viewing these presentations over your computers. It might be a smartphone or a tablet, and how that slide shows up can make a difference for the audience in order to have a high quality presentation for them to see. You want to know the technology you're using. If you're moderating or hosting the webinar, I can tell you from an audience standpoint, there's nothing more frustrating when there's a technical glitch in a presentation. I often practice with the software that I'm going to use. When I first start, and it's a new software, I will often do several practice webinars where I'm just getting used to, you know, how do you advance slides? How do you share a screen? How do you allow your audience to submit questions and answers? Getting to understand the way it works for you as the moderator or the host of the webinar, and how you view it is often different than how a presenter comes into a webinar and views things. So often I'll have two computers set up, one where I'm join as a participant, and the other one where I'm often the host, so I can make sure that all of that type of stuff works smoothly and know how it works. In the next category, it's where we go live. So you've done all this preparation and planning to get your webinar ready, and so we've taken it to the point we're going to go live. And this is important to lay out the ground rules. And what I'm talking about here is just like Jennifer did today's webinar. If there are logistics that your audience needs to know about, it's important to provide those to them at the start of the webinar. Often it's focusing on things like how do you do Q&A, if you're going to allow them to engage with the presenters, how they do that. Will they be able to use their microphones, different things like that. So it's important to lay out those ground rules. We also talk from a presenter standpoint, it's important to accept the fact that you're talking to a computer. The first few times when I did it, it felt very different that I'm busy talking to a computer and could not see the audience. You need to, usually when we communicate with a live audience, we get cues from the way people look and move and respond to what we're saying. That is hard to do in a live webinar, especially something like with our Zoom webinar today where we don't see the audience. But they are out there, and it's important to realize that. And there are things you can do to engage with that audience, and I'll talk about that here in a second. Keep in mind how fast you are going. You are presenting to people, and not everyone is connected through high-speed internet, and this can impact what you present and what you share. Sharing things like videos or demonstrating things often are delays in times due to that bandwidth in the video, and that's something to keep in mind. Many of my webinars, I try to minimize using other people's videos to show something or demonstrations just because of that bandwidth for much of my audiences. You want to engage with your audience. It's important to get them engaged with the presentation. You got to remember they're often at their computer, so they could be doing things like email or other tasks on their computer while they're trying to listen to your webinar. But doing things every 2 to 3 minutes during a webinar to engage them, such as asking them questions, often keeps them focused on the webinar topic. Be truthful. Consider that what you're talking about is that you advertise, for example, a 1-hour webinar. Try to do your best to stick to that 1-hour time frame. Be considerate of your audience. Remember, many of them are joining and only have that window to work within to participate in the webinar. So the last thing to consider, and we heard some of this from Andrea, and that's, what do you do at the end of the webinar? Once you're done presenting, is it all over? Well, not really. For many of us, we need feedback from our audience. We want to know how successful was our webinar in achieving what we set out to achieve. Feedback on the program, I think, is a must. Collecting information on the quality of the program and things like the initial impact that your program may have had on somebody as far as, for example, their aspirations to further look into the information presented or to get an idea of their knowledge before and after participating. This can be very effective, and this information, it can be used then to provide you feedback in developing future webinars. Determine the impact of your webinars. These are important. The quality of the webinar is important, but the real outcome, especially for us in organizations like Cooperative Extension, is the impact that we have with the information we provide. Consider conducting evaluations 6 months or so after a webinar just to determine the effectiveness and the impact of that webinar. Were you able to increase people's knowledge? Did they adopt something that you presented to them? This will help you in developing effective webinars as you go into the future. And let me conclude, you know, these are just tips and tricks and best practices that I've developed and learned over my experiences. I'm sure there's many of you that have had experiences doing webinars, especially during this time of the pandemic, where many of us have moved to virtual platforms. Think about sharing those with others, your colleagues, other people around, so that they don't have to relearn things that you might have already experienced. And realize that the ones I've shared with you today have been effective in me in saving my time and preparing and doing webinars, as well as reducing costs and creating positive experiences for all that have been involved with my webinars. And with that, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob. Great information. And there have actually been some in the chat feed, some comments as you were going along. And I just do want to remind everybody though, so today's webinar will be recorded. That was a question that's come up a couple times now. We'll share that out on the forestry webinar portal probably early next week. And along with the recording of this webinar will also be all of the panelists' PowerPoint presentations as a PDF, and any of the links that we've discussed today or any of the resources, we'll include those as well in that same portal. So be sure to keep an eye out on that for next week. I'll put that link into the chat box again here in a minute. And we also had a question about, or I should say, there have been some questions coming into the chat box. So I just wanted to remind everybody to please, if you have a question, go ahead and put into that Q&A function rather than the chat box. That way we make sure that we get to it at the end. We're not going to be monitoring the chat box at the end. We will be looking at the questions that are upvoted in the Q&A section though. So just a reminder there. So next, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Shan Kamick. She's a wildlife biologist 3 at the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. Shan's coming from the perspective of someone, these are her words, not well versed in virtual meetings, who learned very quickly and is happy to share her lessons learned. So thank you, Shan.
Thanks for having me, Jen. I'm really glad you are putting this on. I really wish we'd had something like this ahead of our meeting. As Jen said, I am a bit of a Luddite, and I would not call myself an expert by any means, but I would like to share what we did with the Georgia Prescribed Fire Council. We have an annual meeting each year, and last year our North Georgia meeting was the first time in North Georgia, and we had a lot of people, and it went really well. So when it came time this year, what do? We're like, we don't want to lose that momentum. Let's go virtual. But none of us had any experience. So I'm here today to just tell you what we experienced and some of the lessons learned, the good, the bad, and the ugly, because it was a great experience and it worked really well. And I think we got some good information out to people. So our goal of our meeting was information sharing, right? So to do that, we chose the Zoom webinar as our platform. Because it was informational in nature. We didn't want a whole bunch of people in there trying to chat each other up. I know that's a big part of these meetings is the networking, but to kind of keep that low distraction, have people present things kind of in a lecture style. So we had disabled audiences, both video and microphone. Also the chat feature, they weren't able to chat, but they were able to type in questions on the Q&A. I would like to say that Zoom offers registration, and I highly recommend doing it because it's very efficient. They let you choose the questions, the branding, whatever. They'll give you data on who's there. They send the reminders, so you can do your own registration, but I definitely recommend just going ahead and doing that through Zoom. So our virtual event was on June the 4th of this year. We did slim our agenda down from 6 hours to 4 hours. We still had very specific breaks, 15-minute breaks in there. We had an hour for lunch. I think that's really important to keep things on time so that if people want to pop in for just a particular speaker, they know that that speaker will be, you know, at the time allotted. We set up our continuing education credits ahead of time. So that's something you want to make sure you do well ahead to make sure that they're going to get the credits they need. The day of, there were a lot of questions about that, even though we specifically said, okay, this is how you get your credits constantly during the day. How do we get those credits? So you might want to, ahead of time, maybe in the registration, explain about that. One thing we did, we had a lunch slideshow of some awesome fire photos and plants that come back after fire, with a little Spotify mix of some instrumental folk music, fire themed. It was kind of a neat thing, you know, it kept people there enjoying their lunch, but they also knew speakers aren't on because I hear the music still. So that was kind of a good break that we liked. We had 7 speakers that day. We did have the Q&A. So people were only able to type in their questions into the Q&A box. So details, we held about 275 people throughout the day, and that was a pretty steady thing. 390 people had registered. So one thing was we could only have 500 people, 400 people registered, but then, you know, over 100 didn't show up. So that's something that we're thinking about moving forward with our South Georgia meeting this fall. I think we're going to have a lot of interest. So we want to make sure that people are serious if they sign up for this webinar, that they actually show up and they're not knocking out somebody else from having a space. From the Zoom registration, we see that most of the people, 224, came from Georgia, but we had 28 different states represented, and that's never happened in any of our live meetings. So that's pretty exciting. Zoom also records the time that each person is sitting in there. So sure, they could have the computer on and then wander off and do their laundry. But we do know that 36 people were there for under 10 minutes. So that's an interesting thing that you can kind of analyze. One thing that we didn't know how to deal with, something to think about, is what if one person dials in at their office, but has like 4 or 5 people watching, right? So you're only capturing that one registration person, but there might be other people watching. Something to think about. So the good, the bad, and the ugly. I highly recommend the Zoom registration. Very efficient. Each person gets a unique link sent to them. I think that reduces the Zoom bombing issue. We did have a very experienced person that we recruited from National Wildlife Federation. He was awesome and really inspired confidence in us and confidence in the whole process. If you don't have somebody like that, I guess my advice would be just practice as much as you can. I even suggested to my boss, we have our next staff meeting as a webinar. So you practice the registration and people having their own unique link and sharing screen and moving in between the speakers. So you kind of get to know the platform. Just like Bob mentioned, it's really good to know how these different platforms work. Practice run a week ahead, very, very critical. I totally agree with that. One thing that our host did in our meeting was the spotlight feature. So when a speaker was speaking, he pushed some magic button and only the slides and that speaker were seen, which was kind of cool. So the rest of us can't be seen in the background. The chat feature being disabled, I think was good. I was the moderator for the questions and I had a hard time keeping up with all those questions. So I think if we had had that chat on, it would have been pretty tough to follow and kind of distracting for the audience as well. One thing we did, we had people's names attached to the questions. I guess initially we were a little worried about riffraff. Don't think that would have happened, but what it did allow is some of the questions we ran out of time or weren't able to address as deeply as possible. Like this is Matt Lawrence, our attorney. We were able to contact that person later through email and follow up with them on their question. So that was cool. I think it was a very good thing to have the monitor running the questions that's very familiar with the speakers and the subject. Therefore, if you had a little bit of time, you could kind of triage what questions took priority. You could roll several questions up together, or you could boot that question down further down the line to a different speaker. So the bad, some of the things that we learned, lessons learned. Bob mentioned this, be careful with videos and be careful with doing things live on the web. Poor Scott had this awesome presentation ready to do a live demonstration of vSmoke. The very night before, there was a ransomware attack on the Georgia Forestry Commission and their whole website went down. So he wakes up that morning, no website, no vSmoke. He did a fantastic job scrambling to figure that out ahead of our meeting, which is awesome. But just one of those things you can't control. So I would recommend don't encourage your speakers to use live web. We did forget to set up an evaluation, and we really wish we had done that. We'll do that this fall. We could send evaluation questions or, you know, informational questions ahead of time in the registration, but also during breaks. I think it'd be cool to just pop in a question and be like, hey, how many of you guys are certified burners? And then you kind of get that engagement that Bob mentioned. Learn the nuances of the platform. One thing that we ran into, registration appeared to be linked to the device. I have not gotten to the bottom of this, but let's say someone signed up with their phone, but then they logged in with their unique link on the computer. Some of those people had trouble getting into our webinar. So that was kind of weird, and they had to re-register. We could improve, I think, our question and answer sessions by giving the speakers, all right, you got 20 minutes to speak, and then we're going to have 5 minutes for questions. We kind of just let them speak for the 20 minutes. If there were a few minutes left, I would roll the questions that I saw in the little QA box. But I think you should say very specifically of like, okay, guys, now's the time. I have a few questions that people have written in, but now's the time. If you have a question for the speaker, we're going to take 5 minutes and answer these questions. One of our speakers had to drop at the last minute, so if you need to fill a certain amount of time, you probably should have an extra speaker in your back pocket just in case that happens. And then it's also nice to have short commercials or just little things just to run across the screen to keep people awake, the engagement that Bob mentioned. Maybe a nice screen with all your sponsors that people can appreciate who is behind the scenes, you know, helping fund the meeting. And then the ugly, not ugly, just think about lighting, right? And what's in your background? And did you trim your nose hairs? And are you awake? No, just kidding. Marty was awake the whole time. But yes, we are on a video, and it's hard to talk to a computer. And yes, I look like a spaz. I love those glasses, but I didn't realize I look like that. And you just never know what you're gonna look like. But the biggest thing is we are all just humans trying to make it in this crazy world, and people want to have fun. You know, they want to learn and they want to be entertained. So just have fun with it. It's a great way to get some energy and enthusiasm and some information out. And so I hope that I have helped you. And if you guys have any questions at all, we have a 2 or 3 page little lessons learned that I can share via email. Happy to do that.
Great. Thank you, Shan. That was lots of great information. Really appreciate all of that. We had lots of good conversation in the chat box happening while you were talking too. So feel free to check out the chat. There's some more information in there from some experiences that other people have had as well. And I did attend that annual meeting that Shan helped with, and I have to say it went so smoothly, and she did such a great job, which is why we thought that she would be a great example to share with everybody today. So thanks, Shan. All right, next we have Laurel Kays. Laurel is an extension assistant with NC State Extension Forestry. Before the pandemic, Laurel regularly organized in-person workshops as part of her position, but now since COVID, she's hosted 2 workshops that were originally planned for in-person instruction and then later moved virtually. So she also plans to host at least a couple more workshops this fall and has attended multiple workshops hosted by others. Thanks, Laurel.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, so like Jen said, I work here out of NC State Extension Forestry. I also help coordinate outreach for the Southern Fire Exchange. And back in the day, if I can get the slide to work. No, there we go. So back in the day when things were different, a lot of my job included setting up in-person events and workshops and field tours for people to get together and to build skills, have conversations, all of that good stuff that we used to get to do when we could get together. And obviously things are a little bit different now. Not only are we doing all of these things by Zoom and WebEx and all of these virtual platforms, but a lot of us have a lot of other things going on, kids running around while we're trying to work, relatives living at home that aren't usually there. It's a very different world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those 2 workshops that I've organized since the pandemic started that we had already planned and moved to virtual platforms. And then I'll talk a little bit about some sort of general lessons learned based on that, and also some workshops that I'm in the process of planning and have attended. So the first workshop we had in mind was a Southern Fire Exchange North Carolina Prescribed Fire Council co-hosted workshop. Pretty standard one-day format, 30 to 50 people, including participants and organizers and presenters. We were going to do morning presentations in a classroom setting, have some discussions, lunch, go out into the field, and look at some managed sites and have some more conversations. That was planned to be held in June, and it became pretty clear early on in April that that just wasn't going to happen. So we quickly pivoted and ended up just making it into a webinar. And so I won't talk too much about the webinar specifics. I think Bob and Shan have covered that better than I ever could. But we already had the lineup for those morning presentations. And so all of those speakers were willing to go to the webinar format. They did the exact same talk they had planned. And it went really well. We had about 230 people attend. We were able to record it, and we've had over 100 people watch that webinar recording since we put it up about 2 weeks ago. We've also began the development of a photo series based on some feedback we got from there. It overall went really, really well. One thing I would say is that because our audience for Southern Fire Exchange and the Prescribed Fire Council is largely professionals, a lot of whom need CFE credits through the Society of American Foresters, a lot of those folks were used to getting those credits through in-person events that have now been canceled. So while I agree with Bob that a lot of times offering CFEs isn't necessarily helpful for a webinar, right now it's been really helpful in getting us more traffic for our webinar series that we do on a regular basis through Southern Fire Exchange. So we also had planned through Extension Forestry a continuation of a series of workshops we've been doing about women's chainsaw safety. And again, this was planned to be a one-day workshop, 15 to 20 people, about 12 to 10 participants with a couple instructors and organizers. And for these workshops, again, targeting women landowners. In the morning, we have some presentations and discussions. We go over parts of a chainsaw maintenance, and basic skills. And then in the afternoon, these women actually get to go out into the field, like you can see in that photo, and handle a chainsaw under instructor supervision. If they have their own PPE, if they have their own chainsaw, they can bring it, and they can actually get experience using their own equipment. And again, that was planned to be held probably in May. Became very apparent very quickly that even with such a small group, it just wasn't going to happen safely, particularly since our audience is older landowners. We just didn't feel comfortable doing that, even if we had been allowed to. So we pivoted and held it via a Zoom meeting instead of a Zoom webinar. We had 12 participants who ultimately attended. We did open registration to up to 20 folks. And interestingly, we charged $10 for this workshop. We wanted folks to have buy-in, to feel like they had skin in the game and to show up. But we did also understand that a lot of folks have lost income, have lost jobs as a result of the pandemic. And so we offered an opportunity for people to register for free, no questions asked. And even though we had 8 people not show up, those were all, except I think for 1, people who had paid the registration fee. The people who took advantage of that free registration were actually largely the ones who showed up for this workshop. And we tried to make it as interactive as possible. Our instructors used a webcam. I'll show you a picture in the next slide to demonstrate parts of the saw, to show what they were talking about. We actually were able to go out and shoot a couple videos of our instructors at the NC State Forest demonstrating some of the concepts, and to use those videos during the workshop. We used breakout rooms to allow participants to talk with the different instructors in sort of more intimate format. And again, overall it went really well. We did an evaluation. Folks seemed to be happy with how it went and feel that they had gained knowledge and skills. It did take quite a while to plan, probably in the 20 to 40 hour range when I tried to tally it up. It took quite a while to film the videos, to edit the footage, to figure out our plan for the workshop, what platform we were going to use, get registration together, get all the information out to the participants. It was fairly time intensive for a fairly short workshop. And so here's our lead instructor demonstrating one of the parts of the saw. And here's all of us in our bright smiling faces, I think most of us at least, at the end of the workshop. And so a couple lessons learned, again, based on those events and other ones as well. I think I already mentioned, planning seems to always take more time than you think it will. Moving things to virtual platforms entails a lot of things that setting up in-person events doesn't necessarily take, or just things that we don't necessarily think about as often when we're planning in-person events, at least those of us who do that frequently. Virtual bandwidth is limited an 8-hour in-person workshop is not something that most people have the bandwidth for sitting on Zoom. I think this is particularly true now that this new virtual world is just sort of the new normal, as opposed to this new special weird thing we're all doing. People have a little bit less bandwidth, and so it's important to be concise, focus on the things that you need to and want to cover in your workshop, and then let people go. And I should say also that all of the things for a virtual workshop you need to consider that you would for an in-person workshop: evaluation, your audience, all of that. But particularly for a workshop, your audience and the things and limitations that they may have. What day and time are they available? And I think that's one of the things that I learned from our chainsaw workshop in particular, is that we scheduled that from 12 to 4 on a Thursday. And for most people that seemed to work. That said, we had 8 people not show up, and we were targeting women. And particularly during this pandemic, it's been shown that women are disproportionately impacted in their careers and other things, being expected to take care of children that may be home, more typically home. And I do wonder if that day and time we chose may have had something to do with folks not being able to come. Consider cost. Again, cost can be a great way to get a little bit of buy-in from folks, get them to come. But particularly as a lot of folks who have lost jobs and income, they may just not be able to pay that cost. So consider a way to just give them a anonymous, unshaming option to register for free if that's possible. And again, particularly during the pandemic, think about the ways that different segments of your audience may be impacted. For example, the COVID-19 impacts different ethnic groups very differently. For example, Black folks, African-American folks have been shown to be disproportionately impacted if that's a sizable part of your audience. Consider that when you're planning your event. And address virtual accessibility. Internet connections for rural folks is a big issue in virtual programming, particularly if you're targeting landowners. So if, particularly now that things are opening a little bit, there's a way you can maybe work with your county extension facilities or a library or a school to provide some sort of maybe internet hub where folks can attend and use the internet to attend your workshop, but still be socially distanced and safe. Definitely consider doing that. Make your expectations clear for participants if you expect them to be engaged the whole time, webcams on if they can do that. Make that very clear, as opposed to something like a webinar where someone might just join and expect to be able to just passively watch and do other stuff. If you want people to really be engaged, make that very clear up front. Reach out to partners who have experience with this stuff. Environmental ed folks and school teachers are great resources. A lot of times they have a really good familiarity with different tools and technology that may be helpful to you, particularly if you want to make things more interactive. And finally, virtual workshops are a different beast. And I think I've heard a lot of conversations lately about the fact that they aren't necessarily ideal. We all want to get together. We want to be in person. But at least for those of us in North Carolina and the South, that doesn't necessarily look like it's going to happen soon. And you can put together really good, interactive, effective virtual workshops. It just does take some planning. So really quickly, here are a couple tools that I think are helpful to make workshops more interactive, a little bit more engaging for folks. And these are just some of the options out there. There are a whole lot. Again, those environmental ed folks and school teachers tend to know and be really up with new tools and technologies that can make these events more interactive. But Padlet is a really good option for sort of brainstorming and collaboration. If you want people to be able to put up thoughts, make comments on the thoughts. If you want to do Q&A, particularly more in-depth polling or Q&A that may not be enabled on a platform like Zoom, Slido and Kahoot and Poll Everywhere, all good options. If you're someone who's less familiar with Zoom or webinar platforms or meeting platforms that you may be using, almost all of those platforms have really good, robust FAQ pages with videos that walk you through how to do different things that are really, really easy to use. Videos, particularly 360-degree videos, are great ways to demonstrate concepts. Again, consider bandwidth. For our chainsaw workshop, for our videos, we sent folks the link and had them watch it on their own computer because folks' internet access just wasn't going to be able to play those well over Zoom. And again, finally, online courses are great, and that can be a great way to give your participants some pre-work, get them to nail down basic concepts, and then come together on a meeting or a workshop and have more of a discussion-based event. So I think that's all I have. Thanks for your time. These are just some thoughts that I've had. I'm sure that other people have other thoughts and ideas, particularly on tools and technology that may have been helpful or that they may know of, particularly ones that are good free options if you're looking for that.
Thanks, Laurel. Yeah, somebody mentioned Jamboard, which is part of the Google platform, in the chat box there, and I'm sure some other people have some other experience as well. So thank you for all of that great information. Just do want to remind people as we go along, so we're on to our last presenter coming up, and the rest of our time, this webinar is an hour and a half, so we will be going until 2:30 Eastern time. We'll have some time left here to get to all of your questions. I do see some great questions coming in the chat box. So for those of you who joined a little bit later, there is an upvote function. So before you put your question in, maybe take a look first to see the questions that are already in there. If you see one that sounds similar to your question, go ahead and upvote that, and that will ensure that we get to your question during the Q&A. Yep, just be sure to put all of your questions into that Q&A function and not into the chat. Okay, on to our last presenter. Michael Robinson is the Executive Director and Conference Planner for the International Association of Wildland Fire. Michael, on behalf of the IAWF, has managed 3 hybrid international conferences and 1 fully virtual international conference. The most recent conference was scheduled as a hybrid conference, however, due to COVID-19, was transferred to a full virtual conference in just 5 weeks. So looking forward to hearing what Michael has to say. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Jen. I appreciate the invite, and thanks for putting this event on. So as Jen said, I'm going to talk today about virtual conferences, and first, much of what Laurel talked about translates to virtual conferences, because essentially a workshop is just a mini conference. So some of the tips that she had were very relevant for the virtual conferences, and there are a little bit of overlap here. So we started planning our hybrid conference, the 3rd International Smoke Symposium, about a year in advance of April of this year. And a hybrid conference is essentially an in-person conference and a virtual conference together. So we were planning on being in Raleigh, North Carolina, and at UC Davis in California, and then also online. So we had hired a virtual conference company that would send professional videographers to both of these sites to record all of the presentations, and then they would live stream to each of these locations and then to our online audience. So early in March, we started to worry about the viability of having an in-person conference. And so after careful consideration, we decided to go to a fully virtual conference. So we decided that on March 10th, which is about 5 weeks before this conference. So we just contacted the virtual conference company that we had contracted with, and they helped us with the transition plan. And it was a lot of work because we had to train and practice with 160 presenters. And we also gave our presenters the opportunity to pre-record the presentations. So we had about 30 people that pre-recorded. So we scheduled times with them. So it was a lot of work, but we have to say it was great because all of our sponsors stuck with us. All but one exhibitor stayed with us and transferred online. We had everybody who registered. I think we had 2 people who dropped out, who decided not to go to the virtual conference, but everyone else just stuck with us and transitioned to the virtual conference. And all of about 20 of our presenters dropped out for one reason or another. So I think we ended up with about 145 presenters that stuck with us. So we had really, really fantastic support from everyone. And just real quickly, I want to just say that the conference is still open. We were able to leave it open for a full year. So everyone who registered for the April conference will have access to all of the recordings for a full year. And just recently, we opened it back up at a discounted rate for people to come on and watch the recordings that took place during the live event. So our target audience were researchers and practitioners working in wildland fire smoke. we had a big public health focus this year because we partnered with UC Davis, the Air Quality Resource Center there. We also had both domestic and international presenters and audience. So the company that we worked with is called iCohere. So that is who we contracted with for our virtual conference company. And this was actually the third time we had worked with iCohere. So we had developed a relationship with them over the years. The first one was in 2013 and the second one in 2016. So this was the third one. And you can see they used WebEx and GoToWebinar for their video platforms. And you can see that their platform is sort of a pretty simple content management based system that looks a bit like a web page, and then people could click on the links on the side here to visit the different components of the virtual conference. So I really want to spend the rest of the time talking about lessons learned because that's what you all want to hear. But the conference went really, really well. I have to say we had about 95% of our, in the evaluations, 95% of the people said that they were extremely satisfied with the conference. And a lot of it had to do with the timing. Honestly, when we decided to go virtual, the World Health Organization hadn't declared this a pandemic. There were maybe a couple of states that were in stay-home order, but by the time the conference came along, 5 weeks later, everyone was at home. Essentially, the entire world was at home, and people were really looking for a way to connect. And so this conference couldn't have been better timed. And people really appreciated that we decided to go online instead of cancel, because there were dozens of conferences that were being canceled at this time. And of course, that's disappointing because, it was easier for us to move online because we already had the contract with the virtual conference company. So I have to say that was part of our decision making, was being able to move it online so quickly. So some lessons learned. We would definitely leave more time for Q&A and transitions. We already had our program finished. Like, our program was finalized. It's 5 weeks from the conference. And we had, 160 presentations in 3 days. They were fast. They were 15-minute presentations. And people generally would be moving from room to room, 4 concurrent sessions. We just didn't quite leave enough time for transition, because typically you probably wouldn't just move your program to an online platform. You would be a little bit more thoughtful about your programming and build in more time for Q&A and transition. And, whether you're doing the hand raise and having the presenters read the questions, or if you're having people chat and having the moderator ask the questions, it just takes more time online. You have to just consider that. The other thing is, we would make the presentations available sooner. So what we did is we recorded all of the presentations, and then we made them all available on Friday, the day after the conference. And our justification for doing that is because we wanted people to focus on what was going on live, and we felt like it would distract from the live presentations. But in retrospect, I don't think that would have happened. I think that you need to make them available right away. People want to watch the presentations when they can, and not everybody can watch the presentations when you're doing them live. Plus, we had a big international conference, and so we had people in Australia that would come on, at 4 o'clock our time, and they would see the last presentation of the day, and then it would be over, and then they couldn't watch the presentations till Friday. So that definitely, I think most workshops and presentations are now making the presentations available sooner. Networking, most of all of our networking was done via chat, and that was, at the time, it worked. And you have to remember when this was April, really early on in the pandemic. Everyone wasn't as proficient with Zoom as they are now. So, but the chat, things got lost, things got buried a bit. And so we actually were able to pivot partway through the conference with this, and we asked people to put into the chat Zoom links, and we asked them to splinter off, and that worked really well. So they would say, at this certain time, we're going to talk about this, join us for the Zoom. And so we were able to pivot a bit on that one. So going forward, I would absolutely recommend the face-to-face, discussions on Zoom, breaking people into breakouts, into smaller groups to talk on Zoom. I think that's really, really important. Our exhibitors, we focus so much time on our in-person show that we were all prepared to have all these vendors on site at the conference. So when we transferred online, it just didn't transfer as well as I would have hoped. We should have left more interaction for the exhibitors. We should have maybe set up appointments or some matchmaking with the exhibitors and the guests. And honestly, I think that you'll be hard pressed to get exhibitors and sponsors to commit to your virtual conference unless you can show them a plan that you are going to drive them to the exhibitors. This is all new to the exhibitors too, this virtual conferencing. So they need to know that they're going to get a benefit out of it. So make sure you have a good plan about how you're going to drive your guests to visit the exhibitors. And then lastly, the posters. Again, we spent a lot of time on the posters for the on-site or the in-person conference, and we had multiple sessions, and we had an early career and students posters, and we had put so much thought into it. When we transferred to them online, we should have, in retrospect, given more time for interaction, and we should have actually just scheduled time for each of the posters to do a presentation. So in retrospect, that is definitely something that we should have done. And so basically, all of our lessons learned have now turned into things that are important for us for the next conference. So what's next for us? We're planning another virtual conference. We had planned a big international conference in California in May of 2021. We already had our venue. We had already started advertising it. And we just decided that we didn't think people were going to be ready for a big international conference next year. I think we'll start seeing some regional conferences and some national conferences, but probably not big international conferences. That's just my opinion. So we decided to make a virtual conference in May. So we're in the process of planning it now. And a lot of Lauren's lessons learned are things that we're considering now. We're being really adaptable. We're being really flexible. The way that we're planning this conference is very different than we plan in-person conferences. We're watching the research and we're following the studies about the best time for conferences, or for meetings, the length, and what people are going to be able to tolerate. Because for the Smoke Symposium, we had 8 hours a day for 3 days straight, and people's tolerance was really high in April for that. But as Laurel mentioned, I think people's tolerance is not going to be for that anymore. So we're just being really flexible and adaptable. So that's where we're heading. So stay tuned on that. So thanks. Stay safe, and good luck with your virtual events. And of course, I'm looking forward to some of your questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Great information. Let's transition here now. Okay. So thank you everyone for joining today's webinar on how to move natural resource programs virtually. All of our panelists today are also natural resource professionals just like you, and so we thank them for sharing their time and experiences with us today. Lots of really great information. We do have a lot of questions though, so we have a little more than 20 minutes. For those of you who can't stay on, this is being recorded and we'll share the recording when we can get to it next week. Along with all of the resources that they've talked about today. But if you can stick on, yeah, we do have about 20 minutes to get to some of the questions that have the highest upvote. So I will pull up the Q&A now, and we'll have all of our presenters. I'll try to figure out, if I can, figure out who the question is actually meant for. I'll do my best to try to figure those out. So let me see if I can find that now. Bob, maybe if you could help me in the, oh, nope, here we go. Okay. So our first question, and for those of you who weren't on earlier, if you're not sure what the upvote, there is a thumbs up feature on the bottom of the Q&A. We are not monitoring the chat for questions, so be sure if you do have a question to put it into the Q&A box. and not the chat feature. So I'm just going to go through the ones with the highest number of thumbs up. We'll get through as many of these as we can. So the first question is going to be for Andrea. And the question is, do you find it an advantage or a disadvantage of doing Facebook Live through Zoom or just straight from Facebook from a technology standpoint?
A little bit. We found that we mostly stumbled in streaming from Zoom to Facebook. It has to do with the meeting settings, and then we had built up some interest on Facebook, and then we couldn't do it. So it's a little bit simpler, fewer steps if you just go straight through Facebook. It's nicer for the presenter supports. The presenters, if there are multiple presenters in different locations, it's easier to coordinate if all the presenters are in a Zoom call. They can use the chat feature amongst themselves and all that good stuff. But depending on how competent your technology skills are, simpler is better. What I like about streaming through Facebook is that there is a perception that Zoom is complicated or you have to have the extra software. And so depending on your audience, and our audience in some cases is a little bit older, and so maybe not as interested in having highly evolved technology experiences. So then going straight through Facebook is a little less complicated. Many people don't have a Facebook account, and we had to, when we did this for another event, a different thing, you don't have to have a Facebook account to lurk, to observe, and to watch on Facebook. And so that is a little bit reassuring for people. It's slightly less complicated, but there are some nice reasons to do it through Zoom if you can.
Okay, great. Thank you, Andrea.
I'll
Next
also say, just really quick, for our Southern Fire Exchange webinar series, we've recently started broadcasting to Zoom and Facebook, or to Facebook. And Facebook Live is not our predominant audience there, so it's different. But it has helped us reach sort of a different, sort of more lay audience while also focusing on the webinar aspect.
Okay, great. Thank you both. Next question, I'm going to address this also to Andrea to start out.
Yeah.
Is it possible to know if someone has watched the entire video or if they only caught the first few seconds as they scrolled through their Facebook feed?
Not that I know of. Maybe some of the other panelists or audience members know this, but I don't think so that I can discern.
Okay.
So
Great.
Jen, this is Bob. From my understanding with the analytics in Facebook, you're able to tell how long somebody has stayed on the video and watched it.
There we go. Great. I haven't dug deep into those analytics, so that's great. Thanks, Bob.
Yep.
And I do notice somebody else in the comments mentioned something similar. There's a analytics, but maybe not on live stream. It's, yep. Okay. Next is, I'm going to address this to Laurel first. I think this was during your presentation. You mentioned that bandwidth is a limiting factor to some viewers. So do you have any suggestions on how to overcome this if you have to share videos, or is it just a cost of doing business knowing that some people will miss out?
So what we did for our chainsaw workshop, and I think it worked really well, was we sent links to videos. So if you have them on YouTube, that's really easy. You can also put them on a Google Drive or Dropbox or similar application and just make it, set the settings so that it's link sharing, anyone can view. And so what we did was when we showed the videos, we just sent the link in the chat box, said mute yourself. We can mute everyone if they didn't do it. Go watch this video, you have X amount of time. And then I screen shared with a timer showing how long people had to watch. And I gave, a little bit of cushion, obviously. And that seemed to work really well. And I think that's probably how I would do it again. Sharing videos over Zoom, unless everyone has really high speed internet, just has never worked for me.
Any comments from any of the other presenters on that one?
Things you can do bandwidth wise is if people are doing like we are, all of our videos are streaming right now as presenters. If we were to turn off our videos, things like that help with the bandwidth. Also, depending on the quality of the video that you're trying to stream, or if you're trying to demonstrate a live website, you can do things to still have good enough quality with a lower resolution. Versus you don't need to do everything in HD, for example, may help.
Yeah, Jen, and for our fall meeting, we are gonna have any of the presenters that have a video, send them to the host who we know has high-speed internet instead of trying to have the presenter send through their, that's one thing that might help.
And so I think by my understanding, it's not only the person playing the video, but the person who is receiving the video, both of those bandwidths matter. So if you're targeting particularly like landowners or folks you know who are working from their home in rural wherever, that's going to be a lot more of a concern than if, you know, you're targeting folks you know have a pretty solid internet connection.
Great. Good tips there. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to address this one to Bob first, but we'll see if anybody else has any suggestions. Are there any security issues with being live? For example, bombers, hackers, etc.
So with Zoom software, they've done a lot to address their security issues. That early March was a lot of concerns. You saw a lot in the media about and everything. Yeah. So they've done things there. When setting up Zoom meetings, you can set required passwords. You can turn on waiting rooms. There are features that you can do to, if you were to run into somebody, example, bombing your meeting. My experience, like, you know, I've done over 200 of these. I've yet to have anybody bomb my meeting. So it's probably not as a big of an issue for our type of programming than maybe for other folks.
Anyone else want to comment on that? I don't know if Facebook, from a Facebook Live standpoint, Andrea, is there anything?
Yeah, we hadn't had any issues. Again, I think our audience, you know, is not likely to be like that. But that's one of the reasons why we have a number of our staff on any live event, so that we could deflect attention or respond to someone. And even if it's not like a black hat hacker, somebody who truly means to do harm, but, you know, someone who has a million questions that are unrelated, or, you know, that kind of thing, which is maybe more likely, you know, having somebody available to just address that so that the presenter can still focus on the main presentation. Having multiple staff on hand to help can deflect some of that.
Great, thank you. Okay, next, well, let me do this one first. This is for Shan. Shan, did you charge a registration fee for the annual meeting? If not, would that have made a difference in people showing up who had registered?
Yeah, we really debated that a lot, and it's just a lot of trouble to have a registration fee, as someone has pointed out. So it was going to be a nominal fee anyway. We got around that with our fall meeting by just getting our allotment up to 1,000 people. So hopefully 1,000 people will accommodate people who just happen to sign up and not come. So we did not do a registration fee, but we thought about it just to make it so that people would be more committed to coming.
And our North Carolina Prescribed Fire Council meeting is also going to be virtual. Super lucky that Shan had to go first because we learned a lot from them. But our council is set up a little bit differently. So we are charging a registration fee, but we have 2 registration options. So folks who are out of state or who just like can't pay the fee, no questions asked, there is a free option. And then folks who do want to support us with that membership can pay the, I think it's $10 or $15 fee.
And I'll add now, I mean, virtual conferences are a little different than the meetings, but sort of best practices for a virtual conference is that the registration is about half of what it would be for an on-site. And a lot of, you know, associations and organizations really rely on their conferences for revenue. And so it's okay to charge. I mean, that's the bottom line. It's okay to charge. People will pay if it's important to them, so.
And we had a much smaller scale event, 3 days, but kind of conference like. We asked a willingness to pay question on our evaluation, and people said that they'd be willing to pay. On the average, the median was $70, and normally we would charge $200 for the weekend long event. So you're not getting as much, but people I think are still willing to pay some, like Michael said.
Yeah.
Great.
and getting sponsorship is key, right? Then you can
Mm.
charge a little bit less if you have good sponsors. And because we had amazing sponsors, we were able to give about 60 scholarships, which was great because we had people from third world countries that were able to attend that never would have been able to otherwise. So that was really cool.
Thanks, everyone. I'm not sure who to direct this next question, so whoever knows about spotlighting. Carrie asks, tell me more about the spotlighting feature. Does anybody?
Bob, do you know about that? I wasn't using it, but I understand that our host was able to just simply click on a speaker and click spotlight, so everything else goes away, all the other go away.
Yeah, so in Zoom, it's basically what you just described, Shan. There is a setting you can select that it highlights the person that's presenting or speaking, and everybody else disappears kind of off the screen. So it's a simple feature in Zoom that you can, and I'm sure other platforms, probably such as Zoom Meeting, WebEx, my experience is many of the different platforms have very similar type features.
Great, thanks. Wasn't familiar with that one. I'm going to lump these next two together. They're both around equipment. So maybe Michael, since we were talking about your headset before we started, there is a recommendation, any recommendations on a headset? And then the other question along those same lines is regarding equipment, any recommendations or things to look for when choosing headsets similar to the ones that we're wearing?
Well, I'll say I have a Logitech. I'll just probably little brand. I don't know if I should tell the brand, but it's Logitech, and it's inexpensive, and I've had it forever, and it works really perfectly. And every computer I use it on recognizes it right away. One thing, it is wired, and I know that Bluetooth might be nice to have a Bluetooth, but I don't know if I have better quality because it is, wired. It's a USB. So that's what I use.
Bob, do you have anything to add to that?
So I bought into Plantronics. I think they're now called Poly. I have both hardwired or wired connection ones, as well as I have a wireless one that works by Bluetooth. Important to find one that feels comfortable on your ears, especially if you wear them for a while. But I think my most expensive one is like $150. Most of the time you can find one for $30 or so that works just fine.
Great, thanks. I'm going to direct this one to both Laurel and Michael, since you both kind of touched on this a little bit. Anthony says he's curious if other educators are concerned about the impacts of social media use on mental health for both the content creators and consumers. How can we make our time online time well spent?
So, yeah, and so that's kind of what I am thinking about a lot now in terms of less so social media and more so future virtual workshops, and really just sort of asking, like, what do I need to get across to this audience? What resources do they have? What resources do I have? And what is the best way to do that? And maybe it's not a workshop, which I think for a lot of us is kind of the default answer a lot of times. But when we are spending so much time online, that can get draining. And I'm not a mental health expert by any means, so I don't know that I have like a great answer to that, other than I think it's definitely a balance. And I think I particularly am trying to be a lot understanding of people who just don't show up to things in this new virtual world than I might otherwise be, which is probably a good practice regardless.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Laurel. I think for our virtual conference, and yeah, less social media than the virtual conferences, being really thoughtful about what we do. Where I think for the Smoke Symposium, we just needed to get it done. Like we just had to get it moved online. But for going forward, we really are being thoughtful about all of those things. And the conference we're doing is about human dimensions, right? And so we're going to be talking a lot about that, and we're going to be talking a lot about COVID as well and how it's affecting people. So, yeah, it's a tough one. I don't think anybody has the answers for that one.
Thank you both. And there were also some comments in the Q&A that other participants had responded to on that one as well.
Good.
Okay, next question for Bob. We'll start with Bob. I know you've done a lot in evaluation. Kristen asked, I would like to know what evaluation tools folks have gotten good results from.
So the way we do it is pretty much linked to SurveyMonkey. Zoom is that you're able to put a link that when people finish a Zoom meeting, it sends them to an external website, and you can send somebody to a SurveyMonkey survey to complete to gather that information.
Anyone else? I know Laurel, you had mentioned some, I believe.
Done pretty much the same thing, is have, you know, a form set up through, I think we've used Google Forms, we've used Qualtrics, but a form set up through a survey software, and either make the meeting when it ends automatically direct folks to that link, or just put it in the chat box at the end of the event.
Okay, great. Somebody also mentioned Menti. I'm not familiar with that one, but Menti in the chat box there. Okay, next question for, it's about distance learning. So perhaps Bob or Shan. A lot of our courses would normally be delivered over a week's time in a traditional environment. Transitioning to distance learning, what are your thoughts on keeping the normal timeframes or stretching it out over a larger time period?
That's a tough one, you know, just sitting in front of a computer and people's attention span. So we're kind of grappling with that and struggling with that right now. I noticed a question earlier was, do we spend more time on these virtual meetings? And we actually slimmed our annual meeting down just for that reason.
The other thing is to think about the format you're delivering it in. If it's if there are things, so the idea of a flipped classroom, right, where you have them review materials, do ratings and things like that, and then you meet virtually to go over learning outcomes to make sure they're, you know, learning the materials and things like that, or having them interact and getting together. You could keep it to a week's time frame, maybe in that type of environment. But I think you would be better off spreading it out and not expecting somebody to spend several hours a day in an online class. That would be tough.
Anyone else?
I just think all of our assumptions about what education is and how education works and what people want and need is just being thrown on its ear right now. I think we don't know. I think what does it take to capture and keep attention? Maybe compressing it all into a shorter period of time keeps their attention, and then they can move on to something else. I know I've signed up for a few online courses and I haven't really gotten to it very well. I haven't, whatever. I think it's just all of our assumptions are on their ear, and we're all going to be figuring it out as we go.
Great, thanks. I think we have time for just a couple more here. So if you are in the participant and see a question that you want to upvote, now is the time to make sure that it gets answered. Next question, I'll try Shan first. And I know Laurel touched on this as well. And actually, all of you touched on this a little bit. What are some ideas to have full attendance? Shan mentioned 100 people that registered did not join. So what are your ideas to encourage everyone to show up?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, we considered having a registration, but we chose not to just because it was a pain. We raised our allotment so that hopefully we'll be able to have everybody that wants to be there be able to sign up. Someone just mentioned in a chat a really good point that perhaps people are signing up for the webinar, not really intending on being there live, but they do want to be recording later. So that's why they signed up, so they would get that email. So that's something to, for sure. That's all I got. I don't know. Definitely if there's money attached, I think people are more likely to attend.
Yeah, for us, the virtual conference, I mean, it's several $100s. So people are registering because they want to come. And we know that people some people aren't planning on attending live and they want to watch the presentations later. I do that all the time. I register for webinars and then I watch the recording because I'll have 3 webinars at one time to watch. So I think that happens a lot. And yeah, and like I said, for a virtual conference, it's expensive. So people are probably going to come if they register, or they're going to watch the presentations later. So I don't have any secrets to that, but
I also think most of us, maybe not all, but most of us have or know of a partner who has a platform that can hold enough people that it's probably not essential that everyone comes. We obviously want everyone to come, we want to encourage, but again, like, people have children at home, they have other relatives that are in their home that aren't usually there. There's people may have lost jobs. Like, there's just so much going on. I think there has to be some understanding that everyone who registers for your event probably isn't going to come. Make a plan to have maybe more capacity than you think you need, if that's possible, and do your best to encourage people to come, but also understand that there's just a lot going on for people.
And even before COVID, we were seeing 50, 60% attendance at webinars from people who registered. I feel like that's kind of normal. And so COVID, continues some of that. We found in one of our events, we had 400 and some people registered. And over the course of 2 days, well into the 375-ish attended some portion, but there was never more than 200 in any one event. And so people come and go, people have obligations and commitments, and it really has, again, to do with our expectations of what's normal, as opposed to getting every single person to sit in their seat the way we do in person.
Did you have one more comment, Bob, before we wrap
No,
up?
I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you.
I was going to say, speaking of obligations and commitments, I do want to honor everybody's time. So we are going to end our discussion now. We do have some questions left in the chat box. I would suggest, if your question was not answered, to contact the presenters individually. We will be sharing on forestrywebinars.net the recording of today's presentation, along with all of the resources and their contact information as well. So we thank everybody for joining. We thank the presenters, and we hope that you got a lot out of today's webinar. Good luck in whatever virtual format you decide to put on in the future. Thank you.
thank you.